Hello, everyone. Welcome to this 8th of the series of talks, Southampton Philharmonic number 8. Just wanted to say before we start that I can only apologize again for the terrible mess behind me. I will do something about it one of these days, but I'm afraid it hasn't happened yet, so I can only apologize for that. I hope it's not too distracting. To start with today or tonight, I just wanted to mention the wonderful conductor, Sir Simon Rattle. I was reading an article about him the other day, which rather amused me. Simon Rattle at the moment is performing, is actually conducting at the moment in Prague, where apparently it is safe or considered to be safe to do so. And he's working with his wife, who is Czech, and with the Czech Philharmonic. I think the answer to your questions, inevitably, how are they doing that? They are performing with a limited audience, and they're socially distancing themselves as players. And that was the interesting thing about this article, because apparently the orchestra, God bless them, because they're now having to sit much further apart than normal, have discovered that they actually need the conductor more than they ever thought they did in the past. And apparently some of them have been going up to the maestro and saying, now we know why you're there. We understand now after all these years. And it sounds ridiculous. And many people say to me, that when they're watching orchestral players, they look as if they don't really watch the conductor at all. I can assure you that they do. It's just that because they're obviously having to concentrate on the music and they don't have the opportunity normally to memorize it, or even sometimes to have seen it before the day. So they have to be watching the music very carefully, but always they will have the conductor out of the corner of their eye. I can assure you of that. Two things though to say about that. One is it's very clear that if somebody does something wrong or something stupid, then every single member of the orchestra will notice. The idea that nobody will notice, I'm afraid, doesn't happen. They definitely do notice if you do something idiotic or you miss a beat or whatever. And the other thing is that for very precise ensemble, they will often quite understandably watch the leader rather than the conductor. Not because there's anything inadequate about the conductor. It's a very, very clear-cut way of making sure that a chord sounds exactly together, because you can physically see when the bow starts to move or when it changes direction is a very, very precise moment. And because players are used to working together and working with a leader, they often do, for things like final cadences and really important big accents, that sort of thing, they will often watch the leader rather than the conductor. But that in itself doesn't make the conductor superfluous. It's just a sort of extra identity that they have with the whole process of ensemble. But it just struck me as amusing that for even a conductor as great as Sir Simon Rattle, that he should have an issue with people not actually watching as much as they perhaps should. And well, of course, the reason is that when they're close together, especially if you're in a pit or some very close positioning on a stage, because you can hear so clearly what's going on, the temptation for everybody, all musicians, is to rely fundamentally on what you're hearing, what you can hear, rather than what you see. And of course, the same applies to choral singers as well. So often you hear me yelling, react to what you see, not from what you hear. And it just struck me as mildly amusing that even Simon Rattle has the same issue. Anyway, good luck to him and good luck to the Czech Philharmonic working in these strange times, and at least being able to do it and perform together in one room, which is very exciting news for them. And hopefully will happen here soon. Before we move on, I also wanted just to mention those of you who've been doing such sterling work for the Miles for Mind I understand that you've raised in above £1,600, £1,600 has been raised, or more than that, by your sterling effort. So congratulations to all of you who are doing that. Fantastic effort. Now, the main subject for tonight's talk, and I hope this won't cause you all to switch off immediately, but I thought I would talk a little bit about fugue. Last week, as you know, I was talking about the whole concept of suspensions and how it's used not just as a harmonic device, but also as a means of moving the music forward, giving the music momentum. And fugue is a similar kind of technique, although a little bit more complex and obviously a bit more involved. So I know that most of you, if not all of you, know very well what a fugue is. So I don't want to bore you over this, but I just think it's worthwhile giving just a few little ideas about what is meant by the word fugue and how they're actually constructed. First thing to say is that a fugue is any piece of music requiring two or more parts, or voices as they're called in fugue. Even if they're played by instruments, they're called voices. You cannot have a fugue with just one instrument or one voice. You've got to have at least two, preferably more. So most fugues will be made up of 3, 4, or even 5 parts, 5 voices, very often. And the whole purpose of a fugue is to be able to create a piece of intricate instrumental music based just on one main theme without having to resort to a text. So although a lot of the fugues that we sing obviously have a text, the fugue itself could exist perfectly happily without a text. When music was being developed around the early part of the 17th century, once tonality was established, composers were very anxious to try and create instrumental music not involving any kind of preconceived structure, which is what a text would do. If you have a text, that immediately means that you can only write according to the text. So when the words run out, the music stops, put it at its simplest. But the idea of a fugue was that this enabled a composer to create quite an intricate piece of musical structure, just using one fundamental melodic line, a melody, if you like, but then could create something really quite complex, and it could last for quite a long time as well and still have some real significance and make perfect sense. So it's around about the early part of the Baroque period that fugues became particularly common and particularly popular. So all the Italian composers of the 17th century and the German composers of the 17th century, up to and including, of course, Johann Sebastian Bach, delighted in writing really quite complex fugues. And I'll explain a bit more about how they actually construct them in a moment. The fugue became synonymous, really, not just with the academic side of musical composition, but in particular, it was synonymous with liturgical music. So anything that required a big finish in a liturgical piece, setting of the Mass or setting of a psalm, whatever it is, especially if there was an Amen involved, that almost inevitably led to the writing of a fugue. It became a kind of tradition. And I think part of the reason for that, when you think about great ecclesiastical buildings, a big cathedral or a big abbey, big church of some description, if you think of the architects putting together these amazing buildings, they're wanting to work at the very limit of what was possible, both in terms of engineering and in terms of the aesthetics of the building. They wanted to make the building as impressive as they possibly could in order to create a house of God on earth, as it were. And composers writing religious music felt exactly the same. They felt compelled to write in this style, which was very intricate, very academic, but also it represented the epitome of what was possible to create with musical composition. So I think that's one of the reasons why they are so common, and you associate them very much with religious music, liturgical music. So Handel, Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, they all excelled in writing very elaborate, very intricate fugues. After Beethoven, as Romanticism really took hold, the whole idea of a fugue became a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit of old hat, and perhaps just a little bit too of the mind and not sufficiently related to emotion and expressiveness and all those romantic concepts that became so much more important in the latter part of the 19th century. So writing of fugues tended to die out towards the end of the 19th century and indeed into the 20th century, apart from a few isolated examples. Shostakovich, for instance, is an example of a 20th century composer who delighted in writing fugues. And it was also very relevant for those composers of the Second Viennese School, Schoenberg, Webern, or the serial composers who were writing 12-tone music. Fugal techniques were often incorporated in that style of music as well. But fundamentally, post-Beethoven, fugue had had its day. But by golly, there are some very fine examples of the fugues before that. So let's just get a little bit of an idea of how fugues are written and what the techniques actually are. The first thing to say is that, like almost everything in music, it's all about keys. Keys and key relationships are the most important aspect of most things to do with musical analysis and musical composition. Because once you have the relationship between keys, just as I was talking last week about the momentum you get from suspensions, if you have a series of key changes or key relationships, that in itself produces a momentum in the music. Something that's just in one key gets very, very tedious after a while, and you literally come to a point where you've said everything you can possibly say, and the music has to stop. There is no way around it. That's why most popular music, for instance, songs tend to be in one key. They don't move out of it. They don't modulate. And how long do they last? 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, that sort of thing. Because that's what you can create using just one key. If you want to make a more substantial piece, then some kind of relationship between one key and another, or involving modulations, moving from tonics to dominants and to relative minors, relative majors, and all those relationships, that's what creates the structure which allows a piece to grow in length and intensity. So keys, very, very important. And I did suggest, if you got this message, that we might relate some of what I'm talking about to the Mozart Requiem. If you've got a score handy, great. If not, don't worry, you will remember it so well. You've all sung it many times, I know. But if we take a very comparatively simple example, if we think of the Sanctus and the Hosanna that follows, the Sanctus, you remember, is... that one. So that is followed by the setting of the Hosanna, the first of the Hosannas. The second one, of course, comes after the Benedictus. But this one's in D major, the key of the Sanctus, and it begins with the basses. That's the opening statement of the Hosanna. Hosanna in excelsis. You all remember that. So that is the theme of the fugue, the subject as we call it, and it's performed in the tonic key, D major. Once they've sung that, the tenors come in next. Now, their version of the theme has been slightly altered. And this is the important thing that I was talking about just now, about the relationship between keys. Remember, the basses started in D major, the tonic. The tenors come in on the dominant. And so on. So in other words, the second rendition of the theme is known as the answer, and it literally answers the subject in a new key, nearly always the dominant key. So we go tonic, subject, dominant, answer. And to make it fit the new key, we have to sometimes alter the actual melody so that it doesn't modulate again into somewhere we don't really want to go. So the modified answer is literally known as a tonal answer. It's an answer to the subject, but it's been tonally altered in terms of its intervals, just to make sure that it doesn't modulate too far away from the home key. So whereas the basses start with a semitone, the tenors start with a minor third. And that keeps them back where they started, so we arrive back in the tonic key. In time for the altos to repeat exactly the subject that the basses had in the tonic. And finally, the sopranos had the answer in the dominant. Now there the basses have the final statement, or almost final statement, back in the tonic, and the tenors have the final statement of the answer, leading us back to the tonic. And by that stage, we're in the last 4 bars. So all in all, it's a very short, not very complex fugue. And in fact, you probably shouldn't call it a fugue at all. It's a fugal exposition. It's just the beginning of a fugue, or sometimes people call it a fugato. It just means a little fugue. And of course, this is part of the Mozart Requiem that wasn't written by Mozart. This is written by Susma. And in some ways it shows, because whilst it's perfectly acceptable music and it does the job very, very well, it's not quite on the same level of the kind of fugues that Mozart was writing by the end of his life. So if that's the kind of standard pattern, tonic, dominant, subject, answer, what happens in a normal fugue when you've got as far as that? Do you just stop, or what do you do? Well, the answer is most composers would then introduce what's known as an episode. It's just like a kind of filling in moment. An episode can be made up of material that you've already had, or it could be something new, or it could be something that's just kind of stock material, which will get you from point A to point B, sometimes involving another modulation, but not necessarily. It could just stay where we were. And then we'll have another series of entries of subject, answer, subject, answer. And so doing it in this way, it's a bit like a rondo in a way, because you can have the exposition, the fugal exposition, episode, another fugal exposition, episode, and so on and so forth, so that you can actually make the piece very long if you wanted to. But inevitably, composers always like to bend the rules. Even when they helped create the rules in the first place, they love to bend them, to kind of do something a little bit untoward. And a good example of that would be Bach's famous prelude, Toccata and Fugue in D minor. You know the one? That one. That fugue, the fugue that follows the toccata, is a very, very standard kind of fugal exposition. At least you think so, in D minor. And in the style of the piece, because the piece as a whole, it's a toccato, it's a kind of showing off piece, and it's designed to be slightly entertaining, not terribly deep, not terribly academic. So the theme itself, the subject, has a very rhythmic kind of idea. And you'd expect there to be a modulation to the dominant before the answer comes in. But Bach doesn't do that. That would be far too obvious. Instead, he brings the answer in the subdominant. So you get this. Tonic, D minor. Answer, G minor, subdominant. Episode. Stop, material. Introduces another performance of the subject back in the tonic key. So he didn't even bother to bring all four parts in before he finished his exposition. Instead, he had that slightly naughty answer in the subdominant, and then went straight into an episode before he introduces the third part, the third voice. Just typical of composers. They're always trying to do something a little bit different. And talking about doing things a little bit differently, if we go back to the Kyrie of the Mozart Requiem, which of course Mozart did write, and remember that the music for this comes at the very end for the Dona Nobis Pacem, which is the same idea that Bach used the B minor massacles, using the same music for the Kyrie and for the Dona Nobis Pacem. But here we've got D minor again, subject in the bass. Modulating to the dominant. So that's where you'd expect the answer to come in the sopranos. In A minor, all good. What we expect, that brings you back ready for the alto lead. Subject again, tonic. Finally tenors. Answer, A minor, dominant. So in that sense, it's absolutely strict. It's exactly what you'd expect to hear. All four parts coming in one after the other, each with the subject in first of all the tonic, then the dominant, then the tonic, and then the dominant. Textbook stuff. But just look what Mozart actually does with this, because rather than waiting for the end of the subject to bring the next part in, he brings the altos in the second bar while the subject is still playing. Each time we have that phrase, the repeated three quavers, Christa, Allah, and then the melisma on the semiquavers, that is the answer. But because it's coming not only in different keys each time and in different voices, but also it's coming in at the same time as the subject. So it's like a counter subject. It's literally what's known as a double fugue. So not just a bog standard fugue, this is a double fugue. And this is why this all those answering phrases also obey the rules of the fugue. So the altos come in the tonic, D minor. When the tenors have it, in bar 5 of this piece. They have it in the dominant, and so on. Then the basses have it in the tonic. And finally, the sopranos have it after the tenor subject. Back in the dominant as well. So really making this very, very complex for himself was Mozart. And of course, this is very much mature Mozart. It came at the end of his life when he had already spent some time studying the music of J.S. Bach. So it's not surprising that he developed the techniques to be able to write a fugue of this complexity. Just a few other things to say about this. The way that the harmonies work and the key structures work is really quite something, because this is very, very adaptable to make it very chromatic. And as you know, as when you've been singing this, you can find places like in this version it's bar 82, the basses, tenors, alto, soprano. And so on, using this theme in very chromatic way to build the tension. And the other thing which he does, which is again quite common in fugues, is to use a technique known as stretto. Stretto simply is the Italian word for narrow, and it means that you're bringing the parts closer together. So rather than wait for one to have it say and then bring the next part in, you overlap them. The basses, before they finish, tenors, altos, sopranos, all brought together one after the other, but rather than waiting after you, they're coming in much, much sooner, much quicker than you're expecting. And that's another brilliant way of introducing tension and excitement into the music. And the other thing that Mozart does here is uses all sorts of different keys. We've had tonics and dominants. That's okay. You would expect that. We've also got the subdominant in this bar 68, tenors, G minor. Then the basses, the next one at the end of bar 70, the subdominant minor. Sopranos, relative major, B flat major. Remember, the piece started in D minor, and here the soprano subject in the major key, B flat major, the relative major. So the basses, copy, such a good idea. And then the next lead is in the altos in F minor. It's that sets up the stretto passage that I played just now. So by using lots of different keys, and eventually by the time we get to bar 87, the basses are back in the tonic. Altos, tonic. That famous interrupted cadence before the adagio. Maximizing the drama, including, if you remember, the last chord of that fugue doesn't have a third in it. It has no decision about whether it's major or minor. We've had this to be diminished seventh chord, which is one of the most dramatic chords you can possibly have. And although it resolves, he leaves the third out. So it's a chord consisting just of D's and A's. Ambiguity about the tonality, and of course that leads into the dies irae. So it's part of the drama of that movement that is helped hugely by that little bit of tonal ambiguity at the end there. I hope I haven't bored you rigid, and I hope that you've made some kind of sense. And so next time you get to sing one of these spectacular fugues like this one, a little bit of the understanding of how it's been put together and why it's been put together will enable you to enjoy the performance more than you otherwise would. That's always the intention, isn't it, about learning about something, especially something which is so personal and so emotional as music. People often think if I understand too much about it, it might spoil it. But in my experience, that doesn't happen. The more we know, the more we learn, and the more there is to learn, it actually enhances our enjoyment of the music. That's what I find anyway. So I hope the same applies to you. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll see you again sometime soon, hopefully next week. All the best to you. Keep well, and see you next week. Bye for now. I didn't wave.